Hello everybody, welcome to part 20 of Kerbal Space Program. The journey continues. Last time we left our interplanetary craft, the Galileo, sat in a 1,000 kilometer parking orbit above Kerbin, just waiting for a mission to come up and top up its fuel tanks so it could get underway, it could start making its way towards Moho. We don't want to waste any time here, so for that very purpose we have launched one of our Brunel Mark I rockets. Greyfried Kerman is in command and she is joined by Erison and Grados. So we are carrying just what fuel we need to top up the Galileo's fuel tanks, and they really do need to be topped up because, as I mentioned last mission, the Delta V margins for this mission really are razor thin, and that's all hidden under that rather sane and sensible looking fairing. Yeah, hopefully we won't see the fairings reach the ridiculous levels they did whilst we were building our space station, the Socrates. Those are just stupid, although fairings like this just look dull and boring to me now, so maybe we'll have to bring them back at some point. Anyway, yeah, the turnaround for the Galileo has been quite quick. Well, it had to be because we had that transfer window open up fairly quickly after the Galileo arrived back from Eve, and we kind of need to get things going a bit quicker because the objectives for this series involve 4 landings, and we've so far done 1 of them, although we have launched various missions to other places as well. The series that preceded this, The Journey Begins, that ran to, 29 episodes, I think. And I think this one may well run a little bit longer. I'm not sure though, we'll have to see how things pan out. But enough wittering on. The crew of our Brunel CSM have arrived at the Galileo and now must bring themselves into dock. We're pretty ideally placed to come in for that rear lower docking port, so we get ourselves firmly attached there. We transfer the fuel, we top up the liquid fuel tanks, we top up the monopropellant tank. I go around double checking and triple checking just to make sure there's no possible way we could cram more fuel into this thing just because of the aforementioned potential Delta V issues, but no, this craft is definitely fully fueled now. With that then, the Galileo is as ready as it will ever be. Grados, Erison and Greyfried's task is finished, and it's time for them to say farewell to the crew of the Galileo and make their way back to the surface of Kerbin. On the journey back home, I am once again going to try to land the command module as close as possible to the KSC. I've made some adjustments since last time, and this time I think it's roughly the joint closest we've come. So sort of a good news, bad news situation. But anyway, our Kerbals splash down in Kerbin's oceans, and with that, it is time, finally, to get the Galileo underway. Fast forward a handful of days and we are back in space with the Galileo, now less than a full orbit away from our transfer manoeuvre, so it's time to get that planned. Now, for those of you who've watched a few of these, you'll know that sometimes this is relatively quick and straightforward, other times it takes an age, and this was definitely the latter. This set new records for the latter. For the initial values here, I'm once again using Alex Moon's transfer window planner, well worth a look, link in the description. But yeah, this requires a lot of fine-tuning. Moho's on quite an inclined orbit. It's very difficult to get a good encounter with it. We do get an encounter, though, after what was, quite frankly, an embarrassing length of time. But we're almost certainly going to need a correction burn after it, just because of how long the burn is, how far before the manoeuvre node we're going to have to start burning, how far after it we're going to keep burning. That sort of throws things off, so yeah, that's going to be tricky, but at least we've got this one dialed in now. So we get the Galileo pointing in the right direction, we orbit round until we're close to our manoeuvre node, we activate those engines, and when the time arrives, we open up that throttle all the way. Now, contrary to what I said in an earlier episode, the engines here don't have more thrust than the Lanta engines we were previously using. That requires a couple of upgrades a bit further down the tech tree. At the moment, they've actually got slightly less thrust. I think it's 42 kilonewtons to 48 kilonewtons per engine. Which, when you have a burn this long, does add a fair chunk of time onto it. Regardless, we complete our burn, we check the map view, and as suspected, we don't have an encounter straight away. So we get a correction manoeuvre planned fairly quickly, we get ourselves set up for that, we burn through that, and after a little bit of fine-tuning after that, we are finally on our way to Moho. Now, this is all going to happen pretty quickly. It's a short journey to Moho. I think by the schedule we have, the Galileo actually leaves Moho to come back to Kerbin before the Ptolemy arrives back from its mission to Junus Moon Ike. But we've got plenty we need to be cracking on with in the meantime, so let's get started with some of that. So I mentioned in the previous episode that our new science lab aboard the Socrates was getting through the science experiments at an alarming rate. I also said that once the Ptolemy returns from Juno, the lab will be given the lion's share of the experiments we've brought from there, but we need something to tide it over. It's just about out of science experiments at the moment. We've had this problem before in this series, and we got round that by launching an Apollo-style mission to the moon using a modified Brunel Mark I rocket, but this time we're going to need to do something a little bit more extensive to really sate the hunger of that new lab in the long term. So we're launching another Apollo-style mission, but this time to Minmus. Not only are the experiments we can get from there more valuable, but also any landings we perform will be much cheaper in fuel terms, so hopefully we can perform a lot more of them. Greyfried Kerman is in command for this one, and she is joined by Grados and Corkin. Now this mission does have a couple of differences from the previous moon missions. If I was running this like the previous missions, I'd crash any potential space junk into the surface of Minmus, but at this point I'm not sure if that booster stage has enough Delta V to get to Minmus, so we're just going to get rid of what we can. So we get the CSM detached, we get rid of that decoupler that's currently shrouding its engine, and we get ourselves docked onto the rest of the stack. Because this modified booster stage is autonomous, if we didn't have enough fuel to make that transfer burn, we'd have just used it to raise our orbit as much as is possible before detaching it and deorbiting it, and using the CSM's fuel from there. But having performed our plane change and set up an encounter with Minmus, it turns out we do have enough fuel to make that burn, so this booster will be meeting its end on the surface of Minmus. So we perform our burn, we get everything set up, we fine-tune it, and then we detach this booster stage. But when we do, our mission vehicles suddenly flip round. I think they were trying to point prograde, which means these two assemblies nudge into each other, and because the margins are so fine on a Minmus transfer, that kind of ruins our encounters for both vehicles. It doesn't take much to rectify it, however, so now our booster stage has its collision course with Minmus, and our Kerbals are onto a decent free return trajectory, which isn't that easy to do around Minmus, so at least the early signs are good. It's a week-long journey to Minmus, but our Kerbals are unfazed by such things, and we arrive in Minmus's sphere of influence, ready to get on immediately with the process of harvesting as much science as we possibly can. We take a complete set of readings from in-space high over Minmus before we transfer those all across to the experiment storage container on board the Brunel CSM, and then we get Grados out to reset what needs resetting. We make our way slowly in towards Minmus, making sure to stop and pick up any of those biome-specific negative gravioli detector readings, and before too long we are here at Periapsis. We're not going to circularise completely here, though. We still have a few more of those in-space high-gravity readings we can do, so we leave our apoapsis up a bit, we perform one more sweep around the planet, and once we get back round the other side, we circularise properly at about 28 kilometres in altitude. From here it's just a case of repeating the whole process over again, but this time from in-space low above Minmus, just taking everything we've learned to date and applying it to strip mining this tiny little planetoid of as much science as is possible. Now, because we've performed quite a lot of these experiments before, some of them are showing quite a hefty repeat experiment penalty, but because we returned those previous experiments to the surface of Kerbin, and because we're going to be processing these in an orbital science lab, that penalty won't actually apply once we get to the business end of things. Anyway, with another pass around the planet completed, we have managed to gain as much science as we possibly can from the relative comfort and safety of orbit. If we want to gather any more, and we do, we're going to need a slightly more hands-on approach. So it's time to head down to the surface. Our lander module is full of fuel and full of science experiments. It's just waiting for us to throw it some Kerbal, so we obligingly supply it with Corkin, who'll be leading this first mission, and Grados, who'll be performing the scientist's duties. We detach the lander, we open up a little bit of separation between ourselves and the old mothership there, and now it's time to choose a landing site, and this is a little bit tricky. Ideally, we'd like to land in the daylight, of course, but we'd also quite like to land on one of Minmus's flats, those level salt bed style regions you can see, but there's nowhere really suitable under our current flight path, so I decide, for this landing at least, we're going to try and land on one of the more level patches of that elevated rocky ground instead. Having made our deorbit burn then, we begin our approach to our chosen landing site. This is relatively straightforward stuff. Minmus is very low gravity. It's very easy to get to and from orbit, to land and to take off. It's why I always say for any new players, the increasing order of difficulty as far as I'm concerned is flyby of the moon, a flyby of Minmus, landing on Minmus, and then landing on the moon in that order. Corkin Kerman's capable hands guide us to a soft landing on Minmus's Midlands, and we haven't visited this biome before. When we get Corkin Kerman out for his very first experience of a brand new planetoid, all the experiments are fresh, we plant a new flag as it's a new biome, and I can't remember my theme for Minmus, so I just cop out and write insert suitable text here. Grados gets out to join Corkin on the surface for her first experience of a brand new world. As our scientist, she takes the surface sample before both of them have to climb back aboard, as we've got a whole bunch of experiments that need doing aboard the lander. We crack open that service bay, we repeat the experiments we were doing in orbit, but this time throw in a seismic reading for good measure, and with that our objectives for this little outing are complete. So we take off from the surface. It only requires a light touch on the throttle. As I said, it's a very low gravity planetoid. If we'd opened it up all the way, we'd probably very quickly find ourselves in deep space, but as it is, before too long we find ourselves instead in our desired initial orbit at about 15,000 metres. Thanks to the low gravity, manoeuvring our way back to the Brunel CSM is quick, easy, and above all, very, very cheap in Delta V terms. We bring ourselves in close, and then we finally get ourselves docked onto our mother craft. We transfer all of those experiments across to the experiment storage container. We did take one extra reading. We got an extra mystery GRU reading that we're not going to be able to use on the science lab, but because we've never been to that biome before, we can take that back down to Kerbin, so we get that stashed aboard our command module. So that is that, a very profitable journey down to the surface of Minmus, and with everything set up and ready to go again, I suppose it's time for round 2. So we'll pick up the pace a bit here. For our second trip down to the surface, Greyfried Kerman will be joining Grados, so we get the crew shuffled about, we get the lander detached, and we get ourselves prepared for our deorbit burn. The planet has rotated since our last outing, but not enough to expose any of those flats regions, which we'd ideally like to land on. But I do spot a relatively flat region of lowlands, so we aim for there. I haven't refueled this craft between trips. We only used a little over a third of our Delta V on that first trip down to the surface, so we should still have more than enough to get ourselves down and back up again. Greyfried Kerman's expert piloting skills see us to a soft, if somewhat bouncy landing, and then it's time for her to climb out and gain her first experience of a foreign sphere. Grados joins Greyfried to take that surface sample. There's no flag this time, we've been to this biome before. Before both our Kerbals clamber back aboard to take the last of these science experiments from this particular region of Minmus. Firing up their engines, our Kerbals once again depart the surface of Minmus, and it's not too long before they are rejoining Corkin Kerman back at the CSM. After a little bit of refuelling, Corkin Kerman takes command of our third trip down to the surface, setting her down on Minmus's now brightly lit Greater Flats. Greyfried Kerman is back in control for the fourth and final excursion, this time gathering the last of the science we're acquiring this mission from the Great Flats region. And with that, our little science-gathering extravaganza is at an end, and it is time for our Kerbals to start making their way back to Kerbin. First things first though, as with similar missions we've conducted in the past, before we get underway, we're going to get rid of our lander. We perform a deorbit burn, we detach the landing module, and then we perform a reorbit burn, leaving our trusty lander to its grisly fate. The transfer burn back to Kerbin is ridiculously simple, as we got a free return trajectory and are hence going the wrong way round the tiny little planetoid. All we need to do is get to the opposite side of Minmus to Kerbin, and then just burn prograde until our Kerbin periapsis is low enough. So we've gathered an impressive little haul of science, and I think it should be more than enough to tide us over until the Ptolemy arrives back from Ike, where, as I've said, we'll be leaving most of the science experiments up with the science lab. I think that's what we'll be doing in future when these expeditions return, just leave most of it to be processed by the science lab. It may even change the way we do our science once we arrive at these planets, but that's something for a future video to address. Arriving at our space station, the Socrates, we bring ourselves into dock before depositing all of those experiments in one of the science lab's experiment storage units. Now, something struck me as I was doing this. I have two experiment storage units, one for repeat experiments, but The science lab can't process repeat experiments, so that was a total waste of time. Fortunately, we only have the one repeat experiment up there, so we're just going to cash that in for some immediate science. With nothing else left to do up in space, then it is time for our Kerbals to make their way back down to the surface. Once again, we're going to try and land this command module as close as possible to the KSC. Once again, well, we'll just gloss over that, shall we? So that brings an end to that particular mission, and it also brings an end to today's episode. I hope you've enjoyed it, everybody. If you have, please consider liking, subscribing, following me on Twitter, all that jazz, link in the description. Next time we have a date with the Kerbal System's innermost planet. But until then, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.